Hello, I'm Jeffrey Sessoms. Welcome to this quick command line tutorial on how to use the move command mv. In this video, I'll demonstrate how to use the move command mv to rename files and directories, to move a file from one directory to another. I'll also show how to move one directory to another. I'll also show an example of how to move a file with a space in the file name. You'll see an example of how to avoid overwriting files with the move command. And lastly, I'll show an example of how to move multiple files at once. Before we start, be sure to download the PDF of essential commands that I created for my command line course. You can find a link to that in the description. So let's get to it. The move command mv moves or renames files and directories and has three forms. All forms accept 0 or more option arguments and are used to modify the command's behavior. In the first form, the existing file argument is the name of the file that mv will rename. The new file name argument is the new file name that mv will assign to the existing file. In the second form, the existing file list arguments are a list of one or more files or directories that mv will move, and the directory argument is the name of the directory where the existing files will be placed. In the third form, the existing directory argument is the name of the directory that mv will move, and the new directory argument is the new directory name that mv will assign to the existing directory. So before we continue, I should caution you that using the move command to move a source file to a destination where the file already exists will cause the existing destination file to be overwritten, losing its contents. So I'll show you how to avoid that in just a moment. First, let's see a simple example of how the move command can be used to rename a file. Right now, my working directory is documents. If we list the contents of the documents directory with ls-l, we can see that it contains several files and a couple of directories called notes and private. If we want to rename this file called resume to resume draft, we can enter the command mv resume draft. Examining the command syntax, we can see that we're using the move command mv without options. Next is the name of the file that we want to rename. And last, we have the new name that we want to assign to the new or to the existing file. Listing the contents of our working directory again with ls-l, you can see that our resume file was successfully renamed to resume draft. Let's clear the screen. Renaming a directory is the same. For example, let's list the contents of our working directory again. Okay. If we want to rename this directory we see here called notes to messages, then we can enter the command mv notes messages. Here you can see that we're using the move command mv without options. Next is the name of the directory that we want to rename. And last is the new name that mv will assign to the directory. Listing the contents of our working directory again, you can see that our notes directory was successfully renamed to messages. Let's see an example of how the move command can be used to move a file from one directory to another. To move a file from one directory to another, we need to specify the path to the file that we want to move and the path to the destination where we want to move our file to. Let's list the details of our current directory and its child directory messages with ls-l tilde/documents messages. In our current directory documents, we have a file called resume draft that we want to move to the messages directory, which contains the files greeting, memo, and a directory called invitations. So to move the resume draft file from our working directory to our messages directory, we can enter the command mv resume draft messages. Here you can see we're using the move command mv without options, followed by the name of the file that we want to move. And last, we have the destination directory where we want to move our resume draft file to. So if we list the contents of the messages directory with ls-l messages, we can see that the resume draft file was successfully moved from our documents directory to messages. We can also rename a file in the process of moving it to another directory. Let's list the contents of our working directory and its child directory messages once again with ls-l tilde/documents and follow it up with messages. If we want to move the contacts file from our documents directory to messages and rename the file to guests, then we can append the new name to the destination directory like this, using mv contacts messages/guests. Here we're using the move command mv without options, followed by the name of the file that we want to move. And last, we have the destination where we want to move our file to, along with the new file name that we want to assign to the file we're moving. If we list the contents of the messages directory with ls-l messages, we can see that the contacts file was successfully moved there and renamed to guests. Let's see an example how to move one directory to another with the move command. Moving one directory to another uses the same syntax as moving a file from one directory to another. Listing the contents of our working directory with ls-l, we can see that it contains a directory called private. To move the private directory to the messages directory, along with its contents, we can enter the command mv private messages. Here we're using the move command mv without options, followed by the name of the directory we want to move, and last is the name of the destination directory where we want to move the directory to. Let's list the contents of messages to see the result. ls-l messages. So here we can see that the private directory was successfully moved to the messages directory. And furthermore, listing the contents of the private directory with ls-l messages/private, we can also see that the contents of our private directory was moved successfully over as well. Let's see an example of how to use the move command to move a file with a space within its file name. Windows, Mac, and Linux operating systems allow file and directory names to contain spaces. Now, for casual users, creating files and directories containing spaces in their file names isn't a problem, but for tech professionals, it complicates commands used on the command line. The reason it complicates commands is because the command line uses space characters to separate tokens or words. However, because spaces are used in file and directory names, we do need to be prepared to handle them. Let's list our directory contents with ls-l. In our working directory, we have a file called cover letter that contains a space between the words cover and letter. Notice that the file name appears between single quotes, unlike the other file names without spaces. Observe what happens when we attempt to move the cover letter file to the messages directory with the command mv cover letter messages. Here you can see that we're using the move command mv without options. Next is the name of the file containing a space that we're attempting to move, and last is the name of the directory where we want to move our cover letter file to. Here we see that executing the command causes an error message stating that no such file or directory exists for cover or letter. That's because spaces are used to separate tokens on the command line, and the command is interpreted as to move the files cover and letter to the destination directory messages. The trouble with that is that the files cover and letter separately do not exist. Only the single file name of cover letter actually exists. So to move a file with a space in the file name, we must quote or escape the space character. There are two methods used to quote or escape special characters on the command line. The first method is to escape space characters within the file name by preceding each space with a backslash. For example, we can enter the command mv cover backslash space letter space messages. Here we're using the move command mv without options. Next, we use the backslash to escape the space character within the file name that we want to move. And last is the destination where we want to move our file to. So listing the contents of the messages directory with ls-l messages, we can see that the cover letter was successfully moved to the messages directory. The other way to escape special characters is to quote them by enclosing them within single quotation marks. Before we see an example of that, let's see what it would look like to escape multiple spaces within a file name using the backslash to escape each one. First, let's clear our screen with clear. Next, let's list the contents of our working directory with ls-l. In our working directory, we have a file called rsvp letter that contains a space between the words rsvp and letter. We want to move the file to the messages directory and rename the file to rsvp letter final with spaces separating the three words. Using the backslash to escape each space within the file name looks like this: mv rsvp backslash space letter messages slash rsvp backslash space letter backslash space final. So here you can see that we're using the move command mv without options. Next, we use a backslash to escape the space character within the file that we want to move. Last, we specify where we want to move the file to. In this case, messages. And here we include a backslash to escape each space character within the file name that we want to rename the file to. Using the backslashes in this way is a valid approach, but the syntax becomes difficult to read. So let's delete our current input and examine the syntax using single quotes to escape the spaces. We can enter mv open quote rsvp space letter end quote messages slash open quote rsvp space letter space final end quote. Here we're using the move command mv without options. Next, we use the single quotes to escape the space character within the file that we want to move. And last, in our destination path, we use single quotes to escape the spaces within the file name that we want to assign to the file that we're moving. Listing the contents of the messages directory with ls-l messages, we can see that RSVP letter was successfully moved to the messages directory and assigned the file name RSVP letter final, including the spaces. Personally, I find using single quotes to escape special characters easier to read on the command line than backslashes, but either can be used. Let's see an example of how to avoid overwriting files with the move command. Earlier I said that if we aren't careful, we could accidentally overwrite an existing destination file, potentially losing hours of work and valuable data. Let's see an example of how that can happen. Let's enter ls-l ~/documents messages. On the screen, we've listed the contents of our working directory, documents, and its child directory, messages. In the messages directory, notice that there already exists a file called memo with a last modified timestamp of November 28, 2040 hours. Observe what happens when we attempt to move the email file from our working directory to the messages directory and rename the file to memo. To do that, we can use the command mv email messages /memo. Here you can see we're using the move command mv without options. Next is the name of the file that we want to move. And last is the path to the directory where we want to move our file to that includes the name that we want to assign to the file we're moving. If we list the contents of messages again with ls-l messages, we can see that the last modified timestamp of memo has changed from its previous timestamp, which was November 28, 2040 hours. In fact, you can see that it actually matches the timestamp of the email file that we just moved to messages, which is November 28, 21:59 hours. That's because we've just overwritten the previous memo file with the email file that we moved to the messages directory and renamed memo. In other words, whatever data the previous memo file contained is lost. To avoid accidentally overwriting a file, we have a couple of options. We can use the list command, ls, to avoid choosing a file name that already exists, or we can pass the interactive option -i to the move command. Let's clear the screen and see how the move command's interactive option can help us avoid overwriting files. Let's list the contents of both directories again with ls-l /documents messages. Again, we've listed the contents of our working directory documents and its child directory messages. In the messages directory, notice that there already exists a file called greeting with a last modified timestamp of October 20th, 2112 hours. Observe what happens when we attempt to move the invitation file from our working directory to the messages directory and rename it to greeting, this time passing the interactive option. So to do that, we'll use mv-i invitation messages /greeting. Notice that passing option I causes the move command to display an interactive prompt before an existing file is overwritten. This allows us to choose whether or not to overwrite the file. So to overwrite the file, simply enter Y for yes. Otherwise, to keep the existing file and abort the move operation, enter N for no. Since overwriting the greeting file is not something that we want to do, we'll enter N for no. Listing the contents of messages again, we see the timestamp of greeting is still October 20th, 2112 hours, which matches the timestamp before the move command was executed. So the move command's interactive option -i successfully prevented us from overwriting the existing greeting file. Let's see an example of how to move multiple files at once using the move command. The move command's second form allows multiple files to be moved to a directory. To move multiple files to a directory, we begin with the move command, followed by a list of source files to move, separated by spaces, then end by passing the destination where we want the files moved to. Let's see an example of that. ls-l /documents messages. In the documents directory is a file called invitation that we want to move to the invitations directory here, found inside of the messages directory. We also want to move the guests file here to the invitations directory as well. To copy both files to the invitations directory at once, we can enter the command mv invitation messages /guests messages /invitations. Here we're using the move command mv without options. Next is the file in our working directory that we want to move. Next is the relative path to the other file that we want to move, found in messages. And last is the relative path to the directory we want to move our files to, also found in messages. Listing the contents of the messages directory with ls-l messages /invitations. We see that both files, invitation and guests, were successfully moved to this invitations directory. That wraps up this quick tutorial on the move command. If you found this tutorial helpful, then hit the like button and be sure to check out my other courses and tutorials. If you're serious about improving your knowledge and skills as a developer, then make sure to click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so that you can get more content like this in the future. Thanks for watching.